In our previous chapters, we discovered how Edouard Manet's formal treatment of his work expresses an ambiguity in his debased figures. This occurs through a corruption of conventional painting. A similar result might be achieved when looking at two icons of modern formalism, Georges Seurat's Bathers and A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte.
On va terminer avec quelques minutes.
In the fourth chapter, we are going to return to Georges Seurat. It is with Seurat that we associate the technique that was known at the time as chromoluminarism, a technique of dividing using little dots that would later be called Pointillism. Today, there is still a tendency to believe that Seurat was above all a formalist, an artist for whom style was the greatest priority. In the US and the UK, however, critics such as Meyer Shapiro and John House or T.J. Clark advocate a more social approach to his work. I would like to combine these two approaches. So here we go then, exploring when formal artificiality goes alongside the artificiality of a bourgeois lifestyle. Are we forced to recognize that Seurat's radical scientific attitude towards painting prioritized style to the detriment of the subject? Is the narrative just a pretext for painting? It is true that his friend, particularly Paul Signac, argued in favour of a strictly formalist reading of his work. But Signac was writing much later. He died in 1935, and so by this date he already knew what path modern painting was going to take. Moreover, he quite legitimately wanted to portray his friend, who had died prematurely in 1891 at the age of just 31, as one of the great pioneers of modern art. It is very understandable indeed. We were already well into the 20th century, and, to make sure his friend would go down favourably in history, Signac promoted Seurat's formalism. He recalled that when Seurat visited the Fourth Impressionist exhibition in 1879, he had been struck by their treatment of colours and light, but from then on he continually tried to improve upon what they had achieved. It was a race of the avant-garde. In some way, he wanted to surpass the Impressionists, even if that was not how he described his intentions. He still depicted the same subjects as them and adopted the same colour palette, but it was just the technique that changed. Later, Signac claimed that Seurat had said, when speaking about La Grande Jatte, that he could just as well have painted Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Orati. Here he is, Georges Seurat. He was a taciturn man, so much so that a few days before he died, we don't exactly know what he died from, although a quick and violent bout of pneumonia is most likely. His baby followed shortly after. It's at this occasion his friends and family found out he had a lover and a child. He had been so organised and rigorous that Edgar Degas, always witty, dubbed him as the notary clerk. Seurat began to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1877. He was a brilliant draftsman, and here is one of his drawings. He studied under Henri Lehmann, a former pupil of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, from a long lineage of great academic painters. He brilliantly mastered drawing techniques, and, if you ask me while thinking about the importance of drawing over colour, I'll say that Seurat may have transferred the intellectual sophistication of drawing into his paintings.
Du dessin à sa peinture.
In 1883, when he was 23, one of his drawings was exhibited at the Salon. It's a Conté crayon portrait. Indeed, a painting like this one was already too impressionist to be admitted at the Salon, with visible crisscross and hatching. The brushstrokes are so well defined that you can almost count their bristles. A year later, he exhibited Bathers at Asnières. Now, we will discuss the glorification of the painting's working-class subject through form. Bathers at Asnières was exhibited not at the Salon, since they had refused his painting, but at a new venue called the Salon des Indépendants. 400 artists participated in this first edition of the Salon des Indépendants, exhibiting their work outside the official salon to avoid the conservative jury and their censorship. It was during the Salon des Indépendants that Seurat met Maximilien Luce and his future friend Signac, both of whom were anarchist painters.
Son ami Signac, qui est également un anarchiste, et d'autres peintres.
Sometime earlier, Seurat would copy paintings by Puvis de Chavannes. This is his version of The Poor Fisherman, landscape with a poor fisherman. Like many of his generation, Seurat greatly admired Puvis. If we look a little closer at the Greek colony, we are given the impression of immobility, a lack of movement typical in Puvis's work. His characters are often so still that we feel as if we are looking at a painting of a tableau vivant, where the figures are classical statues. Look at the position of this character sitting and the child lying down. We find them again in this painting. One is lying down and the other sits with his arms wrapped around his knees. Look at the colour, a marble milky white with a clear-cut outline, almost certainly inspired by Puvis's sculpted classical figures. There's more. The whiteness and clear-cut outline in Seurat's work is reminiscent of fresco painting. This traditional technique was used in particular by Piero della Francesca, whose work Seurat had seen copies of during his studies. Here we have Constantine's Vision and the Resurrection. Italian masters painted onto a damp layer of plaster that would dry within a day, meaning that they could only spend one day on each part. In La Giornata, you can see the sharp outlines and the flattening effect. Frescoes tend to have a pale colour that comes from the layer of plaster below, and we have these same features in Seurat's painting. Now for another interesting detail, the halo of light that we see perfectly on the many preliminary studies and croquetons he made. Many say that he was using the aesthetics of classical art to address a contemporary subject, taking inspiration from fresco painting and Greek statuary. This way he elevates the dignity of his characters, when in reality they were workers becoming members of the new urban proletariat. He deifies them, an idealization that is exacerbated by the luminous halos of light surrounding them. He raised them up to the status of heroes or athletes of modern times. We could also consider it a popular Arcadia, a sort of utopia or well-balanced world fair for the workers. Indeed, in the background we have a frieze that is so white, so perfect, that it seems to be taken straight from a Renaissance painting. Yes, there is some smoke, but not very much, and the smoke is splattered with green dots that connects it to the trees. So we can imagine that this formal glorification promotes a social discourse in favour of the workers. However, I must quickly give nuance to this point. You see that there are men, and only men, which means that they've taken Monday off work. At the time, they called it Saint Lundi. But the French academies of moral and political sciences disagreed with it, suggesting that men should take Sunday off instead, because if they spent their day off with their family, it might temper their drunkenness. Here we have a scene painted by Roger Jourdain, which was accepted at the Salon in 1878. These men are drinking plonk in a watering hole on the island on a Monday, hence the title. There is another troubling aspect of Seurat's painting, the back of the figure that is rendered in a broken line in its final oil version, but was nicely curved in his preparatory drawings. At the time, some believed that congenital syphilis, passed on to children by their syphilitic mothers, could lead to spinal deformities. It meant that a mother with syphilis, and thus of easy virtue, passed on the disease to her deformed children. Therefore, you can see that there are two sides to this painting. Yes, it is a sort of people's Arcadia achieved through the stylistic frozen idealization of characters, but it does not deny the insalubrity of proletarian life, caught between drunkenness and degeneration. Now we will analyse a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte as a pendant of the bathers. By pendant, I mean that they both work as a pair, in terms of formal artifices and the artifices of early capitalism. A Sunday afternoon is a landmark in modern painting and the first large painting to be completed using pointillist techniques, known back then as Divisionism. However, before starting the unavoidable analysis of technique, I wish to tell you this painting's story. The painting dates from 1886 and was presented at the last Impressionist exhibition.
La dernière exposition des impressionnistes en 1886. Alors il semblerait
Camille Pissarro had adopted the technique himself, and so he had more or less forced the others to accept it. This annoyed Auguste Renoir, Claude Monet and Alfred Sicily, who refused to participate in the exhibition, and so it was the last of the Impressionist exhibitions. Seurat signs and dates it in 1886. However, we know that he began painting it in 1884, which suggests that he thought of it as a matching piece for his bathers, especially because they are no more than 1 centimetre different in size and because they are essentially two sides of the same view. Here we are on the banks of the Seine at Asnières, just opposite the Île de la Grande Jatte, the same Île de la Jatte that we have here. Indeed, we find the same boat here and there,
ici à cet endroit-là.
and the same rowers here and there too. Another connection is that the same white lines
Ligne blanche que l'on retrouve là.
in the boy also feature. It is unfortunate if he is drinking water from the Seine. You know what the river water contains. Unless he is actually whistling to a dog. The dog is awake and maybe watching that other one. The idea of pendants is indeed easy to defend as the iconographies match. But perhaps you are thinking that the technique is very different? Well, yes and no. Actually, Seurat began painting his Grande Jatte with the same technique that he had used for his bathers on the left. However, he hoped to exhibit his painting in 1885 at the Second Salon des Indépendants, which never took place, and so he had another year to refine his masterpiece. It was at this time that he developed his technique of Pointillism, abandoning the wide brushstrokes of his earlier Impressionist work and applying the paint dot after dot. But just to confuse us a little more, he then added a few dots to his bathers, supporting the idea that the two are mirror paintings.
En 1884, aux indépendants, il
Seurat had encountered Signac at the Salon des Indépendants in 1884, and both of them became fascinated with painting techniques. It is thought to be Signac who had the idea of breaking the stroke into dots, but it was Seurat who truly developed the scientific impressionism that had been inspired by the two men.
Et cette science de la peinture, il va la trouver chez deux hommes.
The first was Charles Blanc, author of the famous Grammaire des Arts du Dessin. Unluckily for Seurat, he died in 1882, and so he could not discuss his discoveries. The other man, Michael Eugene Chevreul, he was a chemist, so he was a scientist who knew a great deal about colours. The problem was that he was born in 1787, so he was almost 100 years old, and perhaps no longer very lucid. All that was left to aid Seurat were his book. He shut himself away for 2 years and read, among others, On the Law of the Simultaneous Contrast of Colours, published by Chevreul in 1839. Not everyone read the text. In fact, most artists just kept his chromatic circle to hand in their workshop. In this circle, Chevreul had set out his theory of primary, secondary and complementary colours, which we will look at now. A quick reminder first. Chevreul was a chemist, but he was, first and foremost, the director of the Gobelin Manufactory, the former royal tapestry manufacturers. When communicating with his dissatisfied dye workers, he noticed that their frustration came from optical distortion. They would choose a magnificent shade of black and put it next to a magnificent shade of blue, yet the results were disappointing. Why was this the case? Chevreul discovered that colours optically distorted one another. Briefly, he said that a medium bright colour viewed side by side with a bright colour will appear darker than if viewed with a dark colour. In the latter case, it would appear brighter. This is the summarised law of simultaneous contrast. When two complementary colours are juxtaposed, the vibrancy of their hues is enhanced. But when mixed, it is destroyed. One colour seen next to another will always push its complementary colour over the other. Finally, if you close your eyes after looking at something red for a certain amount of time, a green mark known as a visual afterimage will briefly appear. In short, colours influence one another. Chevreul was completely right, but he had left something out. He had not distinguished between the colour light and the colour matter. It was another figure named Ogden Roods who spoke about this in Modern Chromatics, published in English in 1879 and in French in 1881. It is very likely that Seurat got hold of a copy quite quickly. In it, he will have learned about additive colour mixing. When red, blue and green are mixed, rather than subtracting colour from one another, their lights are added together to yield white light. Conversely, and unfortunately, what happens more often when blending colours is subtractive colour mixing. For a painter, this means that mixing colours on a palette will decrease the brightness of a painting, one absorbing the other. This is a problem, knowing that the ultimate quest for the Impressionists was catching light. But as Rood reminds us, applying individual dots or lines of colour onto canvas results in a brighter mixture on the retina.
Or, il recherche la lumière avant tout.
Seurat sought to achieve brighter colours, hence his choice of optical mixing brought about by juxtaposed dots, rather than mixing colours on his palette. These dots are not Lichtenstein-style Benday dots from American pop art, nor mechanical ones produced with a stencil. No, Seurat's dots keep the vivacity of his gesture. All the dots are different. Some are larger, some are smaller, and underneath, he spreads great streaks of paint across the work. Indeed, he achieves a new level of artificiality and brightness in painting.
Luminosité extraordinaire en peinture. Alors,
I'd like to turn to another type of artificiality, a form of artificiality independent of dots. Indeed, there are other types of artifices. Notice that, except for one little girl, each figure is depicted in full profile, or with a full face, each as stiff as a cardboard cutout. This is all over-stylized. Imagine you went for an outing on the Île de la Jatte and found everyone rigid with their head to one side. No, if there's an epic here, it's one of falsity. I'll list more artifices. We know that the banks of the Seine at La Jatte were very high, and yet Seurat had drawn a low shoreline.
de la Jatte était toute douce, elle descendait doucement vers la Seine. Or ici, il l'a rendue abrupte.
But its line formally follows the tree trunk shape. The internal plastic logic takes over the urge of natural representation, opening the way towards modernism. We might wonder if Seurat had purposefully risen up the bank here so that we can see this woman fishing, a non-feminized hobby back then.
Il y avait d'ailleurs beaucoup de pêcheuses, de femmes
Let's
pêcheuses.
continue looking at this theme of artificiality. We have already said that the figures look like cardboard cutouts. What about this skirt? Could there ever be a petticoat in this shape? Instead, it has the crossed legs of an Egyptian scribe. Again, it's a formal artifice. And the same recurs here with this triangle, quite possibly the tip of a petticoat, that echoes this other shape of an umbrella's tip. The monkey's tail, the unattached lead, and the strings on the fan are all decoratively rendered in the shape of an arabesque. Incredibly well organised again are the white puffs of smoke from the bourgeois cigar, perpetuated by the puff of this man leaning against a tree. So yes, stylistic artifices are pervasive and formal interpretives appear to win the battle of form over subject.
Gagner la bataille de la forme contre le sujet.
We might then ask, is the subject just a pretext for painting, as we suggested earlier? We are approaching our conclusion. Signac claimed that Seurat claimed that he could just as well have painted a work like the Oath of the Horatii. Yet, the Oath, painted in 1785, 4 years before the French Revolution, depicts the tensions between two clans, the Horatii and the Curatii, which indirectly points to the tensions between royalists and absolutionists. Perhaps we could say that Seurat painted a 19th century version of Horatii against Curatii, a painted society in which the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are pitted against one another.
In
this work, it is a Sunday. Its families are not workers who are depicted on the Île de la Jatte.
Sur l'île de la Jatte.
So, La Grande Jatte and Bathers form a pair, just like Monday and Sunday, by Roger Jourdain, in which the working class and upper middle class are thrown together. An artificial class, devoted to pleasure, is created. Here we have a fisherwoman, perhaps a miscreant, who instead of catching fish, is actually luring in a client, since the fisherwoman is a homonym for a female sinner. The Île de la Jatte was nicknamed Cythera, or the Island of Love. There is still a temple dedicated to Venus at its entrance today. Here is a woman knitting, caught in a silver space between two men. This one is perhaps a stock jobber, and this one is a rower in a red jersey and cap. But she is without a chaperone, and far too close to these two men she doesn't appear to know. Then in the foreground comes this bourgeois with his cocotte and monkey, just like in a circus, which no respectable spouse would parade around with.
Épouse ne pourrait promener sur l'île de la Jatte. Alors oui, peut-être s'agit-il.
So yes, this painting might serve a social discourse. Seurat creates a form to match his subject. The opposition between the nouvelle couche sociale, with leisured lifestyles, and the working class is made. It is matched by the strangeness of his stiff figures and juxtaposed dots that face his classical and sculptural workers. I hope I've been able to demonstrate the extent to which this period was a time of formal revolution. but also that it should not be considered just an early phase of modernism, as defined by Greenberg. This art came into being to formally give shape to the social changes brought about by Haussmann.
Sous Haussmann.